Well, so sometimes that speed bump can be a fairly expensive speed bump. So when you're to that point, when you are doing your out licensing, and it's not a pure cross license. So cross licensing, I'm interested in your perspective on that as well. But if no cash is changing hands, it's one thing. If there is cash that's changing hands, I'm wondering. As the class saw in the model negotiation we did, the value of intellectual property is a hard thing to measure, unlike the value of, let's say, a new Subaru, where you can tell that it's going to be within plus or minus $2,000 or $3,000 from the list price. What approaches do you folks use when you're first heading into a negotiation? It's like the 3 or 4 weeks before you go to the negotiating table to think about what the price of the intellectual property should be. What tools do you use? How do you prepare?
Actually, it's not weeks, it's months. Literally can take up to a year, because what you want to do is your homework on the competitors' products, and you want to do the claim mapping. You actually have to do the hardcore mapping of the claims against the products. And
can you explain what that means? We haven't covered claim mapping.
Yeah, so basically what you have is you have claims that are in a patent, and you want to take a look at the product, whether or not you have to reverse engineer it, or whether or not you look at publicly available information that talk about the technical specs of the product, and you see how those specs or how those product elements map one-to-one on those claims. And basically what you do is you go into a meeting with hopefully 3 or 4 patents that have been mapped to their products, and you're showing on a set of PowerPoint charts, here's the claim description, and here is what your product, maybe it's a picture of that element of the product, and you show that direct one-to-one mapping and the infringement. And then that will, that's the only way to calculate a value, is to say, okay, you're selling 50 million of these units and they're infringing this patent, and then you convert that to, perhaps a net present value calculation based on a fair and reasonable royalty that you want to charge. And then you add all this up and you say, okay, here's the reason why we're asking for $30 million as a balancing payment. So you got a cross license, which means you're licensing each other's patent portfolios, but inevitably one of them is going to have a balancing payment, and it's based on the strength of that portfolio, and the only way to prove the strength of that portfolio is to do this claim mapping, of which Bob always did a good job of. So.
I think it's the hardest part of all this, is trying to put a dollar value on it. And people have all these theories on how to do it and how to come up with it, and I tell you, it's very difficult. But I think establishing a rate sheet, so to speak. This is what I'm going to charge for these patents. And like Brian is saying, there's a lot of strategy that goes into it. Because if you're a large company and I go out and I ask 3% for this portfolio, there may be some other entity that's going to come in and ask you for 3% for their portfolio, because it's very similar to what you're asking there. So there's a lot of dynamics that you have to consider. And it's really, you have to look at how strong the patents are for that particular technology. If it's a screw in a car, you can't ask for 3%. If it's something on the engine, then obviously you might be able to ask for 3%. So it also depends on how fundamental the patents are on the particular thing you're kind of going after. And I think a lot of it, is kind of what the market will bear. Profit margins come into play. If somebody's not making significant profit margins, how can you squeeze that much out of them? So there's a lot there, but I think the key thing is establishing a legitimate rate sheet and then trying to stay with that rate sheet, because if you're going to litigate, consistency, right? That's one of the things we always, try to do, and even more so when I was at Nokia, because of the standards kind of impact. That's very important. Things have been kind of changed since then, but anyway.
I think the issue is that's sort of more specific to a technology or maybe a product, and there are a relatively manageable number of patents perhaps around it. But I think where it gets very complicated, and I don't have an answer for it, is when you have broader technology areas that may encompass thousands of patents on both sides. So now you're saying, okay, let's see if we can negotiate in technology X. Well, we can't map them on another competitor because there are simply too many. And do you choose a handful, or do you just say generally this is the the strength of this portfolio, these are the priority dates, this is early in this area, or do you have to get into more granular detail? There's no good answer there, because I think it just depends who's across the table from you. Do they want that kind of information, or do they understand as well the relative value of their portfolio and yours? So that's where some of the work my team does on data analysis comes in, which, trying to make sense of maybe a 10,000 patent portfolio and saying to the team, generally this could have relevance to us and ours could have relevance to them in these different ways, and then couple that with financials on product and trajectory, and internationally then it gets even more complicated with those portfolios. So I think if you can do it on a smaller scale with respect to a certain technology space, I think it can be a lot less complicated, but I'm sure you can talk to how that can even be incredibly detailed.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I guess I will now.
I want to hear.
Well, at GE, we were working on both in-licensing and out-licensing valuation of IP. I can give you a specific example, one example that comes to mind that might pertain to some of the, might be relevant. GE Plastics wanted to sell more plastic, and there was, had generated, within the lab, we had generated quite a bit of sophistication in holographic data storage. And the method used a plastic disk. So, wow, a successor to Blu-ray, is going to be a holographic disc. So that's going to help GE Plastic, which never happened because plastics was sold. But we were stuck with this process of evaluating a technology that didn't exist. There was a large number of patents already generated in the industry, and we had our own IP, and so we were sort of faced with looking at worldwide the strength or the value of holographic data storage, IP. Well, okay, the market doesn't exist. There's no real invention out there, and yet a lot of experimentation has been done. So how do you approach that portfolio? And it wasn't small. You can break it down, I guess, in roughly speaking, you look at qualitative aspects of the patent. You can sort of do a questionnaire type thing. Is it enabling? How far along is this particular aspect of the technology? For example, the laser diodes used in that. You can look at chemicals that are needed, things like that, various components, and how far along are they technologically. So you can sort of break it down qualitatively. And then on a quantitative level, you start to use various market approaches. You can look at cost versus, build it yourself or go out and buy it. You can look at market equivalence, but there was none at the time. You can look at, let's say, hypothetically, if the market did exist, what would it look like? How would it ramp up? And you can do sort of a cost basis, or excuse me, an income basis. So you calculate a net present value of this type of a program. And that's substantially what we were doing there. We would look at the strength of the IP on a qualitative level, and then look at the value of the IP through typically a net present value type of calculation.
Another way, an easier way on the valuation, depending on whether or not it's what they're calling standard essential patents. So that's the big debate now, is the treatment of standard essential patents and the ability to do injunctions and et cetera. You saw the interesting news. Well, Qualcomm wound up having issues in China because they were sort of mixing standards essential, non-standards essential, and then throwing out rates that eventually were challenged by the Chinese government.
That was $1 billion problem in China, if I remember correctly.
But it actually wound up being a decent solution for them because it did establish a rate, and that helped everybody, including me, because I have a lot of standards essential patents that we license. And so it established a rate for China. So now we're able to go in there and say, okay, so there's a benchmark, right? So you're looking at comparables to figure out what that is. But in the U.S., it's it's still an open debate on the ability to do these injunctions, ability to stop companies from selling products based on standard essential patents. But it's much different in doing a read on a claims. I mentioned this claims mapping. When you have a spec that the standards organization has established, being able to say, as long as you're satisfying this standard in the way that spec is written, then you're infringing that claim, and it makes it easier to do that claim mapping. And and you can, as long as, and you have the obligation of having a fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory rate that you have to charge based on these standards of central patent.